Over the millennia, wine has encountered many threats and challenges. However, its biggest challenge could have upended viticulture as we know it around the world. In the middle of the 19th century, plants from the New World were all the rage in Europe, and thousands of tons of those plants were imported into France alone. They were planted into the gardens of the elites to study them and to show off with those collections. No one noticed the stowaways, little insects and diseases that were imported alongside with the plant material. One of those insects was particularly dangerous for Vitis vinifera vines, and it was called Phylloxera. According to the Oxford Companion to Wine, the first reporting of Phylloxera was in England in 1863 by a professor from Oxford University. When in the late 1860s the vineyards started dying, it was already too late. The little insect had spread across the old world, leaving a trail of destruction. Phylloxera has a complex life cycle, but the damage mainly occurs when the female 1 mm small louse feeds on the sap of the vine underground. The feeding itself is not the problem, but the European Vitis vinifera varieties have not developed sufficient resistance against the fungi and bacteria that enter the vine through the feeding wounds. This was not a problem for the American vines, as they had built up resistance after coexisting with the pest for millennia. They are forming a corky layer below the wounds that stop microbes from entering the plant. The wine production in France fell by over 70% from 1875 to 1889, and winemakers therefore tried exceedingly desperate methods to control Phylloxera. Flooding showed some positive results, but it wasn't really an option in areas that didn't have access to sufficient amounts of waters or vineyards on slopes. Another popular treatment was pumping carbon bisulfite into the soil. This killed off Phylloxera, but it also killed off everything else, and in some cases even destroyed the vines. In the end, the salvation came in the form of grafting a European Vitis vinifera vine onto an American rootstock. Grafting works like that. You select an American rootstock based on its characteristics and its ability to survive in the location you want to plant it in. Factors like drought resistance or the ability to cope with chalky soils are, for example, factors that are taken into consideration. A cutting of a European Vitis vinifera vine like Chardonnay, Riesling or Sangiovese, for example, are then attached to the American rootstock. At a nursery, they grow together over time and can then be planted into the vineyard. Back in the 19th century, many vignerons were concerned whether grafting their vines onto a foreign plant will impact quality or introduce some of those foxy flavors into their wines. Today we know that these worries were largely unfounded, but the discussion continues on whether PrePhylloxera vines were producing the better wines or not. The procedure of grafting certainly has some downsides. It can introduce plant viruses into the vine, for example, when grafting tools are contaminated. I've tasted some PrePhylloxera wines, like this 1863 Colheita port that I've tasted a few years ago, and I can still taste it today. It is, however, impossible to compare those historic wines to the wines that are being produced today. You just cannot taste a large selection of wines made from grafted and ungrafted vines from the same vineyard, made in the same way, next to each other, in order to decide which one is better. But regardless of that, I want to explore that topic in more detail. My team has selected 4 wines made from ungrafted vines in some of those small pockets of the wine world where that is still possible. I'm going to taste them side by side in order to find out whether there's a common denominator, something that connects them. So let's dive in. So let's start off with the 2022 Sermann Riesling Wurzelechte Altenahr egg from the R region in Germany. You know, Phylloxera has a problem with very poor soils. So for example, sandy soils or slaty soils can be an issue for the little pest. And therefore some areas like the Mosel, for example, or the R still have vines planted on their own roots. Legally, it's not really allowed to replant vineyards with own-rooted vines. You should use grafted vines. That's just a way of reducing the spread of Phylloxera. But some winemakers still just do it. It's kind of difficult to prove that they planted on like own-rooted material. This vineyard was actually planted in the 1930s, and well, back then apparently it was still legal to do so. So the wine is pale yellow in color. Well, it looks like a Riesling, and it smells like a Riesling. It is quite beautiful with notes of peaches and cream and apricots. And yeah, it's really appealing. A very beautiful nose. The wine is really light and lively. It kind of dances across your tongue. 11.5% of alcohol, lots of freshness and liveliness, a long finish. So a very good Riesling. I've never tasted anything from that winery, and I really like this wine. It's for me, this is a 90-point wine. But is there anything that would indicate that the vines were own-rooted, that they were ungrafted? I find it really difficult to argue that point. I think this is a really well-made wine, and maybe it is better because it is from really old vines. People tend to agree that old vines produce higher quality to a certain level. And this is really high in quality, but yeah, I wouldn't say I can taste that this is an ungrafted vineyard. Quite a bit of salinity at the finish as well, so this is really delicious. Beautiful wine. So we're moving on to Rueda in Spain, and this is the 2019 Naiades from Bodegas Naia. Rueda is well known for producing light and fresh white wines, but it's also a region with spectacular vineyards, some of the oldest vineyards in Europe, and this vineyard is actually 130 years old. So some of those vines were actually planted during a time when Phylloxera had just reached Europe, but hadn't quite reached Rueda. Those vines are really gnarly old dudes planted in sandy soils where Phylloxera has a hard time surviving. I was so surprised by the quality of some of those high-end Rueda wines. They can be absolutely delicious, really complex, and they are usually still fairly affordable, but absolutely delicious. So I'm hoping that this wine doesn't disappoint. I mean, the story at least sounds very, very compelling. So let's see what's inside this bottle. In their material, they are stating that most of those vines were ungrafted. So some of them must be grafted, and that would be interesting, kind of tasting the grafted ones separate from the ungrafted ones. But then again, that's really difficult to pull off. And you always have the factor that the ungrafted vines will be a lot older, therefore producing probably a higher end fruit. Looking good. Slightly darker than the Riesling, a pale gold, I would call this color. So this is completely different to an entry-level Rueda. It's much more complex. It was fermented and matured in French barriques, therefore just giving this spicy, smoky note to the wine. But the fruit can actually cope with that really well because there's so much concentration there. So it smells of pears and apple. There's a touch of bacon fat there, but it's not like an in-your-face aromatic wine. It's much deeper than that. On the palate, it's really concentrated and rich, great freshness and liveliness, a lot of substance. I mean, it has lots of power, but the power is then broken up by the acidity. There's a touch of salinity here as well. So it's a whole mouthful of wine. So I'm going to rate this 92 points. I think it's a delicious wine. And after 5 years of aging, it still feels relatively fresh and young. So I'm guessing that this can age another 5 to 10 years easily. This retails at a similar price point to the previous wine. So 25 euros, probably around about $30 US. And I think at that price, this is a real bargain. I mean, just consider the fact that this is from some of the oldest vines in the world, and it's just beautiful and really appealing, but there's this big story, this background to it as well, which makes the wine more enjoyable. So let's move on to the reds, and this is the 2022 Viejas Tinajas from Martino in Itata, Chile. So this Cinsault vineyard is also planted ungrafted. It's not as old as the previous vineyards. It's only 35, 40 years old. But in Chile, it is still possible to plant ungrafted material as the Laos never made it to Chile. So after Phylloxera was already present in North America and then spread across Europe, winemakers started to take notice and importing new plant material became more and more restricted. So today there are some areas that are still Phylloxera free, but it's very difficult to keep out a tiny Laos like that. So Chile is doing its best in order to make sure that Phylloxera doesn't spread across their country. So Cinsault is actually a grape variety that I quite enjoy. It's more of a workhorse variety in most regions, but if you farm it right and keep yields low, it can be super delicious, refreshing and light. This one is actually fermented and aged in amphora, keeping up a tradition that existed in this area since the 16th century. It's kind of crazy to talk about Chile as a new world country if they already started making wine hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but still. So as you can see, this is very pale in color. I mean, it's Pinot-esque. You can see your hand through the wine. It's super light, super light. On the nose, it has this beautiful fruit flavor. So there's cherries there, blackberries, raspberries, a little bit of red currants as well. And there's also quite a lot of spice. So it's really beautiful. This pepperiness, meatiness is a great addition to the clear, bright fruit flavor. Good nose. On the palate, this is actually very long. The acidity is very fresh. There's good grip there as well. Just delicious. You know, even if the region is Phylloxera free, planting vines on their own roots, on rootstocks that are not completely Phylloxera tolerant, can come with some issues. In the early 2000s, for example, the region of Central Otago experienced some outbursts of Phylloxera, which kind of caused a lot of stress amongst the winemakers as they didn't really factor in that risk and had planted their vineyards on rootstocks that weren't Phylloxera resistant. So those areas where there is no Phylloxera are usually very careful even when people enter the vineyards in order to make sure that they don't carry Phylloxera on their shoes, for example, and just by accident introduce it to their vineyards. This is a beautiful Cinsault. It's fresh and lively. It might lack a little bit of depth and concentration, but I still really like it. I'm going to rate it 91 points. So last but not least, we're going to Australia, and this is the 2021 Langmeil Barossa The Freedom Shiraz from a vineyard planted in 1843. Well, I mean, they're saying it's believed to be planted in 1843, so it could be a little younger than that. But still, I mean, that's crazy old. So the vineyard is 181 years old. The vines are still producing fruit and they are able to make a wine out of those grapes. Crazy. But yeah, so this vineyard was planted before Phylloxera was even a thing, which kind of suggests that it was planted ungrafted. I'm always in awe when I walk through those very, very old vineyards. Surprisingly, many of those super old vineyards are actually in the New World and not in the Old World, because in the Old World, most of those vineyards were ripped out at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century because of Phylloxera. But yeah, those super old vines are actually a monument to the history of agriculture, of winemaking on this planet. It's just crazy that something that is living and farmed by humans can survive for such a long time and still produce enough fruit in order to turn them into a great wine. So this is definitely quite a bit darker than the Cinsault. Syrah or Shiraz is known for producing really dark colored red wines, and this certainly is no exception. It smells of plums, blackberry. There's also kind of like a wet soil dimension to this. It's quite beautiful, a little spicy, and there's some black pepper here as well. So it's definitely concentrated and rich. On the palate, it's super concentrated, big. There's quite a bit of alcohol there. I mean, 14.8% of alcohol, but it's well integrated, a concentrated and rich wine with really ripe tannins. And interestingly, there's also a little bit of salinity here. So it just kind of tastes a little bit salty. That might be the common denominator across those four wines. They all showed a little bit of saltiness. Maybe the Cinsault didn't show as much, but this one, the Rueda wine and the Riesling, they all had a little bit of saltiness. Is it due to the ungrafted vines or due to something else? Who knows? It could also have something to do with the age of the vineyard. It can obviously also be something that is introduced into the vineyards because of the terroir. But as those wines were from very different places, I don't think that's the case. Maybe it is actually the age more than the ungraftedness, because the Cinsault was actually not from a very old vineyard, but from ungrafted vines, and didn't show that distinct saltiness. However, this is absolutely beautiful. It's big and bold, so you should eat like a steak with it, but it tastes delicious, and I'm going to rate it 94 points. All right, this was an interesting excursion into PrePhylloxera wines. I really enjoyed this tasting, and I hope you learned something from this video. It's very difficult to pinpoint the characteristics of PrePhylloxera wines. If there was a common denominator, it was this slight saltiness, but this is obviously quite anecdotal just based on those 4 wines. But still, there was this one thing at least that connected all 4 wines. But wait, there was one more thing, and that was the quality. I mean, those wines were really delicious. Maybe that is due to the fact that they are from old vineyards. Old vineyards tend to produce smaller crops and therefore more concentration in the wines. But maybe there was the PrePhylloxera ungrafted magic in play as well. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please like it down here and subscribe to my channel. My question of the day is, what do you think about PrePhylloxera vines, ungrafted vines? Do they add quality? Are they better than grafted ones? Let me know down below in the comments. I hope I see you guys again very soon. Until then, stay thirsty.